Moving on to AB 1235. Witnesses in support. Witnesses in opposition. Finance.
The Department of Finance is opposed to this bill as it expands eligibility for full-scope Medi-Cal and likely results in significant general fund costs not included in the budget. The bill would result in increased general fund expenditures in the Medi-Cal program for added long-term care costs. The local assistance costs are unknown but potentially significant. For example, if the allowance were increased to $600 per month for 1,000 qualified beneficiaries, the Medi-Cal program would see increased benefit costs in the low millions of dollars annually. This bill also is likely to result in increased state operations costs to develop state plan amendments, promulgate regulations, and increased community administration workload associated with changes to their eligibility system.
Thank you. Comments or questions from committee? Seeing and hearing none, without objection, we'll move this item to the suspense file. Moving on to Assemblymember Bloom's items, beginning with AB 801. Witnesses in support. Witnesses in opposition. Finance.
The CSU estimates system-wide costs of $1.7 million for a half-time position at each campus to provide the services required in the bill. The Community College's Chancellor's Office estimates local staffing costs of up to $6.6 million for community colleges to modify their residency determination processes and verify eligibility of students as homeless youth. The Chancellor's Office also estimates local one-time costs of up to $11.3 million and ongoing costs of $1.7 million for community colleges to modify electronic records processing systems. To the extent that the Commission on State Mandates determines that the bill imposes a state mandate on those community college districts, the state could be required to reimburse them for those costs.
Thank you. Questions or comments from committee? Seeing and hearing none, without objection, we'll move this item to the suspense file. Moving on to AB 974. Witnesses in support. Witnesses in opposition. Finance.
The Department of Finance hasn't taken a formal position on this bill. We would note that any funds remaining after successor agencies have paid the RDA's enforceable obligations are distributed to the affecting tax agencies and are referred to as residual pass-through payments. Those residual pass-through payments received by K-14 schools generally offset the state's Prop 98 obligation on a dollar-for-dollar basis. In the 15-16 governor's budget, it assumes that K-14 schools will receive approximately $970 million in residual pass-through payments in 15-16, thereby generating a commensurate amount of Prop 98 general fund savings. Out-year savings are expected to grow to more than $1 billion. By allowing the successor agencies to expend proceeds from bonds issued subsequent to December 31, 2010, the bill reduces the anticipated out-year Prop 98 general fund savings associated with RDA dissolution by an unknown but potentially significant amount.
Thank you. Questions or comments from the committee? Senator Bell.
Yeah, it's kind of strange that a bill that has in the hundreds of millions of dollars worth of impact, we don't have an estimate of what it's going to cost. So just want to make that comment. I think we ought to try to find out legitimately what it's going to cost.
We can do that during the suspense process. Any additional comments or questions on this item? We will move this item to the suspense file without objection. Moving on to Assemblyman Lowell's item, AB 883. Witnesses in support. Witnesses in opposition. Finance.
The Department of Industrial Relations estimates costs between $1 and $3 million from the Labor Enforcement and Compliance Fund to enforce the provisions of this bill and process new retaliation claims. DIR notes that the cost estimate is difficult to make because the bill creates retaliation protection for non-employees, because it would cover job applicants instead of just employees. So the population that would actually avail themselves of the protections is difficult to estimate. Retaliation investigations for non-employees may prove to be more lengthy than other retaliation investigations. The bill also expands DIR oversight to third-party internet website providers. And as I mentioned in the other bill that did the same, this is outside of their existing statutory framework, and DIR has no experience regarding how many cases and investigations of third-party internet website providers this could generate.
Thank you. Questions or comments from committee? Seeing and hearing none, without objection, we'll move this item to the suspense file. Moving on to Assemblyman Daly's item, AB 932. Witnesses in support. Witnesses in opposition. Finance.
The Department of Finance is opposed to this bill because it moves the purpose of specialized license plates away from being a forum to highlight state priorities to an advertising platform for private organizations and a funding mechanism for their priorities. DMV estimates an implementation cost of $438,000 in the motor vehicle account. Their implementation costs will be offset by fees collected for specialized plates, but typically that has not occurred until later on in the renewal cycle. The Department of Parks and Recreation estimates the implementation of this bill will cost approximately $373,000 general fund over 2 budget years to conduct outreach activities required by the statute to establish a specialized plate. They estimate ongoing costs would be approximately $180,000 annually.
Thank you. Questions or comments from committee? Seeing none, without objection, we'll move this item to the suspense file. Moving along with December Salas's items, beginning with AB 935. Witnesses in support. Witnesses in opposition. Finance.
The Department of Finance is opposed to this bill because the Integrated Regional Water Management Program is based on competitive grants right now, and specifically carving out regional conveyance programs compromises the integrity of the competitiveness of that program that the grants are based upon and would decrease funding available for other water management activities. We note that the existing Integrated Regional Water Management Program allows conveyance projects, but it doesn't have a carve-out for them.
Thank you. Questions or comments from committee? Seeing and hearing none, without objection, we'll move this item to the suspense file. Moving on to AB 937. Witnesses in support. Opposition. Finance.
Department of Finance is opposed to this bill because it would result in significant additional general fund costs. The Department of Water Resources estimates the bill results in $54 to $78 million in one-time general fund and $18 to $24 million ongoing general fund costs for development of new plans and ongoing involvement with disadvantaged communities. Given the complexity of groundwater management planning and taking into account that disadvantaged communities often lack expertise in this area, the requirement to provide technical assistance amounts to requiring direct funding of consultants or staff to participate in their local groundwater management efforts at an average cost of approximately $450,000 for each of the 127 high and medium priority, and approximately $75,000 for each of the 388 remaining low and very low priority basins.
To the suspense file. Moving on to AB 1032. Witnesses in support. Opposition. Finance.
No file.
Comments or questions from committee? Seeing and hearing none, without objection, we'll move this item to the suspense file. Moving on to AB 1201. Witnesses in support. Opposition. Finance.
The Department of Finance opposes this bill because it's premature and it results in significant general fund cost pressures to develop the plan. The Department of Fish and Wildlife indicates that it requires $5.8 million and 6 new positions in 2015-16 and $1.3 million and 10 positions in 2016-17 to initiate the plan development based on the recommendations from the final report developed by the State of Science Workshop on Fish Predation in the Central Valley Salmonids in the Bay Delta watershed. One-time costs include $5 million for boats, vehicles, contracts, and equipment. The Fish and Game Preservation Fund is not a viable resource because it has a structural imbalance and will be insolvent in 2016-17 unless addressed. Implementation of the plan is estimated to be considerable and requires an ongoing appropriation and permanent redirection of department staff and resources.
Thank you. Comments or questions from the committee? Seeing and hearing none, without objection, we'll move this item to the suspense file. Guess my boss has come to see how we're doing. Moving on to Assemblyman Rocky Chavez's item, AB 947. Witnesses in support. Opposition. Finance.
No file.
Comments or questions from committee? Seeing and hearing none, without objection, we'll move this item to the suspense file. Moving on to AB 1014 by Assemblyman Thurman. Witnesses in support. Witnesses in opposition. Finance.
The Department of Finance is opposed to this bill because the bill would cost up to $5 million in Prop 98 General Fund to fund the grant program and $379,000 General Fund for the department to administer the grant program. The state's current truancy laws already include early intervention systems to encourage schools to work with students and parents to reduce truancy and absenteeism. Additionally, LEAs already have an incentive to ensure students attend school to maximize the local control funding formula allocations.
Thank you. Questions or comments from committee? Seeing and hearing none, without objection, you have a question, Senator Mendoza?
No, he was just talking about the river.
Okay. There is a river in LA, just to remind everybody.
Mr. Senator Bell was just asking if the river runs through Kevin's district. Yes, well, that's a nicer part of the river.
That's an actual river, unlike what we
Right.
have. Isn't that a coincidence, right? It's the Pro Tem's district. Without objection, we'll move this item to the suspense file. Moving on to AB 1496. Witnesses in support. Opposition. Finance.
The Air Resources Board estimates fulfilling the bill's requirements will require 4 permanent technical positions and approximately $1.5 million in the cost of implementation account annually. The positions utilize the state monitoring information provided by contractors to identify the major sources of methane emissions within the state. The positions would also conduct life cycle analyses of greenhouse gas emissions resulting from natural gas production and importation into California. The Air Resources Board believes that permanent positions are needed to maintain the most accurate estimates and continually research and update the methane emissions model over time. We note, however, that the Air Resources Board has not provided sufficient information to validate the cost estimate, and that any request for additional resources will be looked into during the budget development process this fall.
Can you repeat that just for fun? Thank you. Questions or comments from committee? Seeing and hearing none, without objection, we're going to move that item to the suspense file. Moving on to AB 1018 by Senator Cooper. Witnesses in support. Opposition. Finance.
The Department of Finance opposes this bill because it's unnecessary given recent task force efforts and creates additional general fund cost pressure. The statewide Special Education Task Force released a report in March of 2015 that included a recommendation to eliminate barriers preventing education entities from accessing or increasing Medi-Cal services and reimbursements. And state agencies have identified a number of options available to local education agencies to access additional federal funding. This bill results in one-time costs of approximately $126,000 general fund for the Department of Education to identify stakeholders, plan sessions, convene meetings, and report on findings and recommendations.
Thank you. Questions or comments from committee? Seeing and hearing none, without objection, we'll move this item to the suspense file. Moving on to Senator Eduardo Garcia's items, beginning with AB 1091. Witnesses in support. Opposition. Finance.
The Student Aid Commission indicates that it would request $120,000 general fund ongoing for one position to implement the provisions of this bill, including the legislative intent. The Commission reports that the resources are needed to develop and administer an application to allow high schools and school districts to identify students who have not completed the FAFSA or DREAM application. We'd note that while creating more standard processes for both the collection of grade point averages and the verification of high school graduation could result in one-time costs to develop the systems, doing so should also result in long-term savings on workload compared to the existing processes. To the extent that the Commission requires school districts to change systems used to report grade point averages, schools could be entitled to a reimbursement of their costs.
Thank you. Questions or comments from committee? Seeing and hearing none, without objection, we'll move this item to the suspense file. Moving on to AB 1533. Witnesses in support. Opposition. Finance.
The Department of Finance is neutral on this bill because it streamlines the organizational structure for federal funds that fund economically distressed communities and provide capital to businesses in economically distressed areas. We do note that the iBank may require up to one position and $150,000 general fund to administer the grant funds.
Thank you. Questions or comments from committee? Seeing and hearing none, without objection, we'll move this item to the suspense file. Moving on to Assemblywoman Olsen's items, beginning with AB 1099. Witnesses in support. Opposition. Finance.
The Department of Finance opposes this bill because it's unnecessary and it's inconsistent with the administration's policy that local agencies should have the flexibility to shape their programs and processes in a way that best meets the goals included in their local control and accountability plans. This bill creates a state reimbursable mandate, likely in the tens of thousands to hundreds of thousands of dollars in Prop 98 General Fund, by requiring school districts and county offices of education to post that required information on their internet websites.
Thank you. Questions or comments from committee? Seeing and hearing none, without objection, we'll move this item to the suspense file. Moving on to AB 1161. Witnesses in support. Witnesses in support. Opposition. Finance.
The Department of Finance is opposed to this bill because it negatively impacts the Proposition 98 funding guarantee in the short term, because of the backfill to the general fund occurs when the credits are allowed or certified, while the designated annual amounts to count toward Prop 98 are based on when the credits are claimed or used. Additionally, the bill amends the same statute as AB 104, the Education Trailer Bill, which defines full-day state preschool funding as qualifying for Prop 98 general fund appropriation. Chaptering out this bill would repeal the AB 104 amendments and result in the state having to backfill approximately $177 million in Prop 98 general fund with a like amount of non-Prop 98 general fund. Amending the bill to address that chaptering concern would remove that fiscal concern.
Questions or comments from committee? Seeing and hearing none, without objection, we'll move this item to the suspense file. Moving on to Assemblymember Chow's item, beginning with AB 1172. Witnesses in support. Opposition. Finance.
The Department of Finance is opposed to this bill because it would result in costs not in the administration's current fiscal plan. The Office of Emergency Services indicates that the bill's fiscal impact would be an ongoing $650,000 general fund for the new Director of Cybersecurity and 2 other full-time positions. OES is assuming they would need to seek a general fund augmentation because they're unable to absorb these additional costs, and it's unknown whether other funding sources allowed in the bill would actually materialize. In addition, the bill does not indicate the task force per diem, but another assumption made by OES would be that the members that are not heads of public offices, departments, or agencies would receive $100 per meeting day, and all would receive travel, lodging, and meals, which is consistent with their other boards.
Thank you. Comments or questions from committee? Seeing and hearing none, without objection, we'll move this item to the suspense file. Moving on to AB 1258. Witnesses in support. Witnesses in opposition. Finance.
The Department of Finance opposes this bill because the pilot program that it establishes is inconsistent with the long-term goals of local control funding formula, because it separately funds the costs of a district's computer science programs without a clear expectation that these costs eventually become integrated within the school district's LCFF resources. School districts already have incentives to design high-quality programs and ensure all students achieve the outcomes established in their local control accountability plans. While the Department of Education would likely incur administrative costs in the hundreds of thousands of dollars as a result of the bill, establishing the pilot program is contingent on the superintendent certifying to the Department of Finance in writing that there are sufficient funds in the account to support the cost of the pilot.
Thank you. Questions or comments from committee? Seeing and hearing none, without objection, we'll move this item to the suspense file. Remember, we have moved to our last bill of our agenda, AB 1266 by Assemblywoman Gonzalez. Witnesses in support. Witnesses in opposition. Finance.
We're neutral on this bill, but we have a concern that the bill requires both an advice letter and a formal proceeding. The 2 processes are functionally mutually exclusive, and either process alone can be used to resolve issues. A formal proceeding would be more appropriate to this bill, as the process allows evidentiary issues, whereas an advice letter process does not. The PUC estimates the bill would require 1 administrative law judge for 18 months and $210,000 PUC utilities reimbursement account to conduct the formal proceedings required by the bill.
Thank you. Comments or questions from committee? Seeing and hearing none, without objection, we'll move this item to the suspense file. Members, this concludes our agenda for today. I want to thank you and thank Mr. Lovell for being here, hanging out with us. Around there. 6.5 hours.
More than that.
Thank you. Oh, I now remember. So thank you, members, for being here with us. This concludes our appropriations hearing for today.